Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Louise, and in this video I'm going to be doing my review for The Terror by Dan Simmons. Honestly, what a good book. So basically The Terror is it's following the Sir John Franklin expedition for the Northwest Passage, which departed England in 1845 and was from there lost. Honestly, if you don't know anything about the Franklin expedition, I definitely recommend watching Wendigoon's video about it, because I watched his video about the Franklin expedition before I ever read The Terror, and it was definitely a very good video. To be fair, Wendigoon does a bunch of very good videos, so I'll try to remember to leave a link to his video in the description. But long story short, basically what happened was that the Franklin expedition got trapped in the ice in the Arctic Oceans north of Canada, and eventually the crews abandoned ships and started making their way south, and everyone was lost. Of course, The Terror is a fictionalized supernatural horror of the Franklin expedition, and honestly, as you're reading this book, you can see the amount of research that Dan Simmons did for this book. At the very end, there's a little bibliography of all of the resources that he used, all the different books, all the research papers, everything. So in the book, the first few chapters kind of go back and forth in time. I think the first chapter follows Captain Crozier of The Terror, and then the next chapter after that is with Sir John Franklin, as he is just before he gets permission to go on this expedition. Honestly, one of the funniest things about it is that the way that Franklin is characterized made me really dislike him, and it's just so funny because he is the leader of this expedition. It's just really funny that I really very deeply disliked Franklin. The monster that is stalking the Franklin expedition is implied really heavily in the first several chapters. It becomes more obvious further into the book you go. So probably about the first half of the book is definitely the slower part, the slower half, but it is building up the characters, it's building up the atmosphere, it's building up the situation. But at about 40% in, everything starts to really ramp up. It becomes a lot more exciting. It becomes, I don't really want to use the word fun, but so much happens, so much is going on, there's so much conflict. And it's not just the monster that brings conflict. There's conflict among the crew as well. But it is a very exciting book. It's very fun. I definitely recommend reading this book. But I think overall I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. I didn't really care for the ending. I'm of the opinion that a monster story doesn't really need to have the monster explained. It kind of ruins the mystery of the monster. But that's not to say that the ending was bad. I just didn't feel that it was particularly necessary. Overall, everything is written really well. You can see the amount of research that Dan Simmons did, and it's such a well-written book. There are characters that you love, and there are characters that you hate. There are events that happen because of decisions that were made earlier in the book that just leads to even worse scenarios. And the whole time you're just sitting there shaking your head, wondering why some of these characters can be so dumb. Now I'm going to go into spoiler territory. Again, I just really loved this book. It was very good. It took me like 2 months to read it. But spoilers. I hated Franklin. I hated him so much. I thought he was egotistical and dumb, and he was unwilling to learn from his own mistakes. He was unwilling to learn from other people's mistakes. He was unwilling to take other people's opinions. That's the major thing. Because not only does his second-in-command, Fitzjames, say, oh, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that and do something else. Captain Crozier of The Terror, Franklin was captain of the Erebus and the leader of the expedition. Crozier is the captain of The Terror. Captain Crozier is like, oh, how about we sail, south, or maybe go back the way that we came, and maybe Franklin could have saved the expedition if he had just listened. Doesn't matter. I just hated his character so much because he makes so many mistakes that could have been very easily avoided. Of course, Franklin's not the only character that I hated. I really hated Hickey as well. Hickey leads several different mutinies. He kills one of my favorite characters at, 60%? 70%? I just hated that guy. But Hickey bringing conflict amongst the crew really balances out the conflict with the monster. Everything to do with the monster is always very high, fast-paced. It's always high stakes. The monster is the thing that, you're supposed to be afraid of. Whereas with Hickey is just a man. He's one of the crew. You don't really expect him to be, evil, but it just kind of goes to show that it's not just monsters that you have to worry about. Sometimes the worst monsters are the people. There's so much that happens in this book. I don't know how there can be so much that happens in such a small space. Like, if you look at maps of the Franklin expedition, basically so you have King William Island, and the ships were stuck in the ice just to the west of the coast, of the northern coast of King William Island. The ships were trapped in the ice, and basically they went south. Once they abandoned ship, they went south towards the Adelaide Peninsula, and it is several hundred miles, but it's such a small space. But I think about half the book takes place on the ships, and the second half of the book takes place on the ice. And everything really ramps up once the ships are abandoned. Like, in the first half of the book, you're worried for the crew because there's something that's stalking them, but they're safe, more or less, on the ships. And then they abandon ship, and then not only are they suffering from scurvy, they're suffering from starvation and frostbite, and they're being hunted by the monster, and you have to be worried about the crew members killing each other. It went from really intense on the ships to extremely intense and absolutely horrifying on the ice. So with what I knew about the Franklin expedition going in, I knew that there had been evidence of cannibalism. And when I went into this book, I was thinking that it was probably a Wendigo. With what little I know and understand of Native American culture and beliefs, I thought Wendigo's a pretty good guess. But when the monster showed up so early in the book and there having not been any cannibalism, I kind of had to rethink the possibility. I later decided that it could possibly be a shapeshifter because early on there is a Native American man that is accidentally killed by crew of the Franklin expedition, and he had a totem of a polar bear that he had hung around his neck. And I thought, maybe it's a shapeshifter. Maybe it was this man who has turned into this terrifying polar bear-esque monster. And then I kind of made it the next step immediately after that and said, or maybe it's just this man's spirit because he had been shot and killed. And I wasn't wrong 100%, but I definitely wasn't right either. So it was a spirit, but the book goes into far more detail, and it's better written than what I can possibly say here. But it was a spirit created by a god that was at war with two other gods, but the spirit was eventually banished to Earth, and the Native Americans of the North American continent, especially in the far north, I think in particular the far north, I believe it's the Inuit people, they sacrifice their tongues to it so that they can communicate with it better. I'm not doing a very good explanation, but they do sacrifice their tongues to it. They can communicate with this spirit monster telekinetically, and they do this to keep this spirit monster from going any further south, because if it goes any further south, it will absolutely destroy all of humanity. And this explanation of the monster is well written. Like, when you read it in the book, it's very well written. It's very interesting. I'm just kind of the opinion that it's not necessary. I don't really care for my monsters to really be explained. And that's more of a nitpicky thing on my part, and it's just how I feel about it. But that doesn't mean that it's not well written. It's very well written. And of course, the scenes with the monster are some of the best scenes in the book. For example, the scene where Franklin dies, the whole thing with the hunting blind after Gore's funeral was just very terrifying. When Blanky is being chased on the masts of the ships, that was terrifying. The scene with the carnival, with where everybody's dressed up, was absolutely terrifying at the very end. And like, all the scenes with the monster are some of the best scenes. They're harrowing, they're terrifying, they're kind of sad sometimes too, because you can really, really love some of these characters, and then they just die. Honestly, the fact that Blanky, and he's an ice master, so Blanky goes up against, I say up against, but he encounters the monster on 2 separate occasions and survives both of them and loses a leg. That's all he loses. Everyone else that interacts with the monster dies. It's just so terrifying. But there are some character deaths that were a little jarring. I say a little jarring, but I mean, I went into this book expecting every character to die, so them dying isn't what surprised me, it's just the method in which they died. So I believe it's after the ships have been abandoned, where I think they're at Camp Terror on King William Island, and Irving has gone off on his own away from his reconnaissance group, and he happens across some traveling Native Americans, and he begins to build a rapport with them, and he notices that one of the other crew members seemed to have gone looking for him, and they were standing up on the ridge. So he goes to tell them that everything's okay, that the Native Americans mean no harm, and it's Hickey, and Hickey kills him, and it was just so terrible, because you don't see the event of Hickey killing him, not really, but you do see some of the aftermath, and it was just absolutely horrible. Completely tore him apart. It was just really horrible. And I really liked Irving. He was kind of naive, but he was a good guy, you know. Another character that I really liked was Dr. Goodsir. So there were 4 doctors on this expedition, and 3 of them died during the mass carnival. And Goodsir is the only one that's surviving past that. And eventually he's kidnapped by Hickey and his group, and he ends up poisoning himself. He creates a whole concoction of drugs, and he just kills himself rather than allowing Hickey to kill him. He also leaves a note that says, "Hey, by the way, my body is really poisonous, so don't eat my flesh." I feel like I've done a horrible job explaining a bunch of stuff because I'm kind of bouncing around. But I do recommend reading this book, so... But there's one character that I loved a lot, but I was not satisfied with his ending. So there's Captain Crozier, and after Franklin dies, he's leader of the expedition. He's captain of the Terror. He is a good leader. He does everything that he can to keep as many people alive for as long as possible. And later in the book, Hickey attempts a mutiny, and eventually Crozier tells Hickey and anybody that wants to leave with Hickey to leave. But Hickey and a handful of others come back and with the intention to kidnap Goodsir and kill Crozier. And the way that things happen is that there's this hole in the ice, and there's a trail of blood that leads up to this hole in the ice. And Crozier's officer's jacket is floating in the water at the bottom. But Crozier survives this. We're never told how, and it feels kind of like cheating because Crozier survives. And as much as I love Crozier, I don't think he should have survived. There's one other character that once she was introduced, I was like, oh yeah, she's probably going to survive. And that is Lady Silence. She's a Native American woman who has had her tongue cut out. She was traveling with the Native American man that I mentioned earlier in this video. But throughout the book, she's not super relevant. Once you finish the book, you understand why she sticks around. It's more or less to kind of protect the crew as much as she can. But she's hardly in the book until the end. Lady Silence is the one that saves Crozier, but it's never explained how she does it. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But, yeah, that's kind of everything that I can think of to discuss. It was definitely a really good book. I really enjoyed the monster. The monster was scary. Like, you never get a very clear image of it. It's kind of a polar bear with an extended neck, which is just absolutely terrifying. I mean, I hated Hickey and I hated the mutineers. I loved Crozier. I loved Irving. I loved Goodsir. I loved Lady Silence. It was just such a well-written book, and it was deeply researched. Dan Simmons did an amazing job with this research. I think the only downside is that this book released in 2007, and the Erebus and the Terror weren't even, like, the wrecks of the ships were not discovered until 2014 and 2016. If Dan Simmons had waited, like, another 10 years before he wrote this book, he would have had pretty much as much information as physically possible. But anyways, this is a really good book. I definitely recommend reading it. And it's kind of a big book. It took me like a month and a half to read it, which is a little sad. There's some things that feel kind of unnecessary, like the whole scene with Crozier and Franklin's niece, I think her name's Sophia. Like, that whole chapter felt kind of unnecessary. I did not like it. I mean, I guess it kind of builds Crozier's character, but it still didn't really feel very necessary. But that was probably my least favorite chapter out of the whole book. Everything else was really good. So, again, 4 out of 5 stars. If you have time to read it, definitely read it. I read it on Kindle Unlimited, so if you have Kindle Unlimited, that is a great way to read it. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like. If you're interested in what I have to say about other books or have recommendations for other books for me to read, please let me know and consider subscribing. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks again. Bye!